They laughed when the poorest man in Red Hollow dared to raise his hand. The sound rolled through the wooden church like dry thunder, sharp and careless, bouncing off the rafters blackened by years of coal oil smoke. Elias Harper stood near the back pew, hat in his hands, coat sleeves worn thin at the elbows, boots powdered with the pale dust that never quite left this town, and for a moment he did not lower his arm. Outside, the late afternoon wind pushed against the church windows, carrying the smell of dry sage and distant cattle, but inside it was all polished boots, pressed vests, and men who measured a person's worth in acres and bank notes. Mayor Thomas Caldwell stood at the front beside a rough pine table where the town charter lay open, his silver pocket watch chain catching the light. They were voting on the Western Tract, 200 acres of scrub and shallow creek bed that the railroad company wanted for a line that promised progress, profit, and the kind of future men like Caldwell liked to toast with imported whiskey. Elias cleared his throat once, not loudly, just enough to remind himself he still had one. "You?" someone muttered from the second row, not even bothering to hide the grin. Another voice followed, louder. "Since when does a man who owns nothing get a say in something worth thousands?" The laughter rose again, easier now, encouraged by numbers. Elias felt it press against his chest, not like a blow, but like a weight, steady and suffocating. He could have stepped back. He could have let his hand fall and slipped out the side door the way he had slipped out of so many rooms before. But he stayed. His arm trembled slightly from being held up too long, yet he kept it there, palm open, waiting to be acknowledged like any other citizen of Red Hollow. Caldwell tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Mr. Harper," he said, drawing out the name as if testing its value. "This meeting concerns landowners and taxpayers. Surely you understand." A few men nodded. A woman in a feathered hat hid her amusement behind a gloved hand. Elias swallowed. His father's name had once been spoken in this very building with respect, back when the Harper spread covered a full mile along the creek and the barn roof didn't sag under every winter storm. Back before drought and debt and a signature on the wrong line turned a family legacy into a single-room shack at the edge of town. "It's still my town," Elias said quietly, though his words barely carried past the third pew. The laughter returned, softer now but sharper, like small stones skittering across hard ground. And then, from the very last bench near the rear wall, there came no laughter at all. There was only the faint tap of a wooden cane against the floorboards. Heads turned slowly. A woman dressed in black, her face hidden behind a fine dark veil, rose to her feet with unhurried grace. She had been sitting there the entire time, unnoticed or perhaps simply unrecognized. The air in the church shifted, not with noise, but with attention. Elias lowered his gaze for just a second, unsure whether this new movement meant further humiliation or something else entirely. The mayor opened his mouth to continue, to restore the rhythm of mockery and motion, but the veiled woman stepped forward into a shaft of dusty sunlight and spoke in a voice calm enough to quiet a storm. "Let the man speak." The words did not echo, yet they carried farther than the laughter had. "Let the man speak." The simple sentence settled over the room like a heavy wool blanket in winter, muting every restless shuffle and whispered remark. Mayor Caldwell straightened slowly, as if reminded that authority could be observed as easily as it could be claimed. He studied the veiled woman with careful eyes. Most people in Red Hollow knew one another by the sound of a cough or the shape of a hat, yet she remained an outline, a silhouette wrapped in black fabric that caught the dust floating through the late afternoon light. Elias Harper lowered his raised arm halfway, uncertain whether to feel grateful or more exposed than before. The eyes that had laughed at him now shifted, calculating, curious, measuring the weight of this interruption. Caldwell cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said with a politeness sharpened by caution, "this meeting follows procedure." The woman took another step forward, her cane resting lightly against the wooden floor. "Procedure does not erase a man's voice," she replied. Her tone was steady, neither loud nor pleading. It carried the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it. A murmur moved through the pews, softer than before, like wind passing through dry corn stalks. Elias felt the room tilt in a way he could not explain. For years he had learned to read a crowd the way a rancher reads the sky. He knew when to expect a storm and when to expect nothing at all. This felt different. Not thunder. Not sunshine. Something suspended between the two. Caldwell folded his hands behind his back. "And you are?" he asked. The question hung longer than it should have. The veiled woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward Elias. "You had something to say about the Western Tract," she said. It was not a suggestion. It was an invitation. Elias swallowed and found that his mouth had gone dry. He glanced at the open charter on the pine table, at the signatures that promised progress to men who already had enough, and then at the faces that had decided he had nothing worth adding. That land, he began slowly, his voice rough but steady, was not empty when the railroad men first came asking. It has a water line under the North Ridge. Shallow but steady. It runs even in August. A few brows lifted. Water in August was worth more than talk of expansion. Elias continued, the words gaining strength as they left him. "My father mapped it 20 years ago. He filed the survey with the county clerk. It is not scrubland. It is a future pasture if handled right." Someone in the front pew shifted uncomfortably. Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The veiled woman remained still, her presence anchoring the space around Elias like a post sunk deep into the earth. Outside, a wagon rattled past on Main Street, the sound distant and ordinary, yet inside the church every breath seemed accounted for. Elias finished speaking and let his hands fall to his sides. No one laughed this time. The silence that followed was not kindness, but it was not ridicule either. It was something closer to recognition, and in Red Hollow that was rarer than rain. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like frost surrendering to morning light. Mayor Caldwell stepped toward the pine table and rested his fingertips on the open charter, as if it could steady the ground beneath him. "A survey filed 20 years ago does not change today's opportunity," he said, his voice measured, careful not to sound dismissive now that the room was listening differently. "The railroad offers certainty, jobs, growth, a depot that puts Red Hollow on the map." A few men nodded again, though without the earlier ease. Elias remained where he stood, hat hanging at his side, shoulders squared not in defiance but in quiet resolve. He had not planned to speak this long. He had not expected to be allowed this far. The veiled woman shifted her cane slightly, the soft tap against the floor drawing attention without demanding it. "Certainty for whom?" she asked. Her question did not accuse, it illuminated. Caldwell's gaze moved to her once more. "For the town," he replied. "For every family that wishes to prosper." "Including those who no longer hold deeds?" she asked gently. A murmur rose again, smaller but sharper. The Western Tract had once been Harper land. Everyone knew that, though few spoke of it since the foreclosure sale held on a windy morning 5 years earlier. Elias felt the old memory brush against him like cold water. He remembered standing outside the courthouse, watching strangers bid on acreage his father had walked step by step, fence post by fence post. He remembered the creek running low that year, the dust settling on his mother's grave like a final argument. He pushed the memory aside and focused on the present. "If the water line is preserved," he said, "the town can lease grazing rights. It will not make anyone rich overnight, but it will not drain dry in 10 years either." Caldwell's jaw tightened again. "You speak as though you still have a stake in that ground," he said. The words hovered, close to challenge, but not crossing into insult. Elias met his gaze. "I have a stake in this town lasting longer than a promise from men who will not stay once the tracks are laid." The statement settled heavily. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the church windows, and a few heads turned instinctively toward the sound, as if the land itself had answered. The veiled woman stepped closer to the front now, the hem of her black dress brushing the wooden floor. "The survey he mentioned," she said, "is recorded. I have seen it." That drew attention more effectively than any raised voice could have. Caldwell blinked once, a small pause that did not escape notice. "And how would you know that?" he asked. She reached into a small leather satchel at her side, her movements unhurried. The room leaned forward without meaning to. "Because," she said calmly, "I was present the day it was signed." The words did not strike like thunder. They settled like truth, simple and unadorned, yet heavy enough to shift the weight of the entire room. The room did not breathe for a full 3 seconds after she said it. "I was present the day it was signed." The words lingered in the air like dust caught in a beam of light, impossible to ignore once seen. Mayor Caldwell straightened, the confidence he had worn so easily now sitting a little tighter across his shoulders. Present in what capacity? He asked, each word placed carefully, as though stepping across uncertain ground. The veiled woman opened her satchel and withdrew a folded packet of papers bound with a thin, faded ribbon. The parchment was old but preserved, edges softened by time rather than neglect. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply laid the documents on the pine table beside the town charter. The faint scrape of paper against which sounded louder than it should have. Several townsfolk leaned forward in their pews, craning for a clearer view. Elias watched from where he stood, unsure whether hope was wise or foolish. The survey was commissioned by Jonathan Harper, she said evenly, speaking Elias's father's name without hesitation. A few older men exchanged glances. They remembered that name. They remembered a time before drought and debt. It was witnessed, she continued, by 2 landholders and 1 legal guarantor. Caldwell's eyes flicked down to the top page, scanning the signatures visible through the thin veil of dust. And the guarantor? He pressed. The woman's gloved hand moved to the edge of her veil, not lifting it yet, only resting there. My husband, she said. A ripple passed through the congregation, subtle but undeniable. Red Hollow had been founded on the back of one man's vision and capital, a man whose portrait still hung in the mayor's office, framed in dark walnut. His widow had withdrawn from public life years ago, rarely seen, spoken of more as memory than presence. Elias felt something shift in his chest, not triumph, but recognition. He had seen her once as a boy, standing beside her husband at a summer fair, her posture straight, her eyes observant. Caldwell cleared his throat again, though this time the sound lacked authority. Mrs. Whitmore has not attended a town meeting in nearly a decade, he said carefully. Forgive us if we did not expect. He let the sentence trail off. The veiled woman finished it for him without raising her voice. If you did not expect me to remember what was promised. She lifted the top page and turned it so the front rows could see. Inked clearly beneath the survey map was a clause, written in firm, deliberate script, reserving shared water rights to the Harper family in perpetuity unless willingly surrendered. The word willingly seemed to settle like a stone. Elias had signed foreclosure papers under pressure, under hunger, under the slow grind of unpaid interest, but he had never surrendered that clause because it had never been brought before him. Caldwell's composure faltered for the first time. He knew the difference between a debt collected and a right overlooked. The room began to understand it too. No one laughed now. No one shifted impatiently. Even the wind outside seemed to pause against the church walls. The veiled woman rested her hand lightly on the document. Before this town sells what it believes is simple land, she said, it should first decide whether it intends to honor its own foundations. The words were not loud, yet they carried the weight of history, and for the first time that afternoon, Elias Harper was no longer the smallest figure in the room. No one reached for the document at first. It lay there between the town charter and the mayor's steady hands like a mirror none of them had planned to look into. Mayor Caldwell adjusted his vest, buying a moment that felt longer than it was. Foreclosure transfers, all interests, he said finally, his voice firm but no longer effortless. When Mr. Harper defaulted, the bank assumed control. The town purchased the tract lawfully. He spoke as a man accustomed to agreements printed in black ink and sealed with predictable outcomes. Mrs. Whitmore did not argue his tone. She only lifted another page from the packet, thinner than the first, its edges lined with age. The foreclosure covered acreage and structures, she said. It did not extinguish conditional water rights without direct acknowledgement of that clause. Her gloved finger rested beside the sentence in question. There is no signature here relinquishing it. The congregation leaned closer now, not out of spectacle, but out of dawning comprehension. A rancher in the front row removed his hat slowly, as if indoors etiquette had returned to him after being misplaced. Elias felt the weight of every eye shift from ridicule to reconsideration. He had signed papers under the dim light of a bank office, hands rough from failed harvests, stomach hollow from rationed meals. He had trusted that what was presented was complete. He had been wrong about many things in his life, but he had not knowingly surrendered his father's waterline. Caldwell drew in a measured breath. Even if that clause stands, he said, shared water rights complicate development. The railroad will not invest in disputed property. Then perhaps, Mrs. Whitmore replied softly, the town should resolve the dispute before promising what it does not fully possess. Her words were neither sharp nor triumphant. They were practical. That practicality unsettled more than outrage ever could. A farmer near the aisle cleared his throat. If the water runs year-round, he said cautiously, that is worth considering. We have lost 2 wells in the past 3 summers. Another voice followed, hesitant but sincere. The railroad men are not planning to live here. We are. The shift was subtle but real. The laughter from earlier seemed distant now, like something overheard in another building. Elias remained still, resisting the urge to step forward or claim vindication. He understood something about pride that the room was only beginning to learn. Pride shouted too early. Dignity waited. Caldwell looked from face to face and recognized the change. Authority in a small town was less about office and more about consent, and consent was thinning by the minute. He glanced once more at the clause, at the ink that had outlived its author, and then at Elias, who stood with the quiet steadiness of a man who had endured being unseen for a long time. This matter, Caldwell said carefully, will require review by the county clerk before any vote proceeds. It was not surrender, but it was no longer dismissal. Mrs. Whitmore gathered the remaining papers, but left the critical page on the table, as if to remind them that truth did not retreat simply because it was inconvenient. Outside, the wind moved again across Red Hollow, lifting dust along Main Street. Inside the church, the future of the Western Tract no longer felt like a foregone conclusion, and for the first time that afternoon, the poorest man in town stood not as an interruption, but as part of the decision. The congregation did not disperse when the mayor called for review. They lingered in the pews as though leaving too quickly might undo what had just taken place. Sunlight slanted lower through the tall windows, turning the floating dust into strands of gold that drifted between faces now stripped of easy certainty. Mayor Caldwell closed the town charter with deliberate care and placed his palm over it for a brief second, as if feeling for a pulse. Until the county clerk confirms the language, he said, projecting steadiness he did not entirely feel. No agreement with the railroad will be signed. It sounded procedural, responsible, almost benevolent. Yet everyone in the room understood that an hour earlier he would not have hesitated. Elias remained near the back, hat in hand, resisting the urge to search the room for approval. Approval was fickle. Respect was quieter. Mrs. Whitmore stood beside the table, the single page containing the clause still visible beneath the church lamps. She did not reclaim it. She allowed the town to look at it, to wrestle with it. A rancher with sun-creased skin stepped forward first. If the water line holds through August, he said, glancing toward Elias rather than the mayor, that changes what we thought we were selling. Another man nodded, slower, thoughtful. We have been chasing quick growth for years. Maybe steady is not the worst thing. The shift was no longer subtle. It moved like a tide, not crashing but persistent. Caldwell noticed. Authority built on momentum required that momentum to continue forward, and now it had stalled. He turned toward Elias with a measured expression. Mr. Harper, he said, the title landing differently than before. Are you prepared to provide evidence of the water's current condition? The question was no longer a dismissal. It was an invitation edged with scrutiny. Elias lifted his chin slightly. Yes, sir, he answered. I walk that ridge every week. The spring still runs beneath the limestone. Not strong enough to flood, but steady enough to last. He spoke without embellishment. No promises of riches. No grand claims. Just fact, as plain as the dust on his boots. Mrs. Whitmore inclined her head faintly, as though acknowledging that truth rarely required decoration. From the back rows came no laughter now, only the soft rustle of shifting coats and the thoughtful clearing of throats. Outside, a horse snorted and a wagon wheel creaked along Main Street, life continuing as it always had. Yet inside the church something had altered. The poorest man in Red Hollow was no longer an interruption to progress. He had become part of the town's memory, and memory carried weight. Caldwell glanced once more at the page on the table and then at the faces around him. We reconvene in 3 days, he declared. Until then, no further negotiations. It was a compromise shaped by necessity rather than generosity. Mrs. Whitmore finally retrieved the document. folding it with care before placing it back into her satchel. She did not speak again. She did not need to. As the townspeople began to file out, hats in hand and voices low, Elias remained still for a moment longer, absorbing the unfamiliar sensation of being heard. The church doors opened, letting in a wash of late afternoon air scented with dry grass and distant rain that might or might not come. For the first time in years, Elias stepped onto Main Street, not as a man tolerated at the edges, but as one whose words had shifted the course of Red Hollow without raising his voice at all. The church steps emptied slowly, boots descending into the red dust of Main Street without the usual chatter that followed a town decision. The sun hung low over Red Hollow, stretching long shadows across the storefronts and turning the glass windows amber. Elias stepped down last. His hat settled back onto his head, the brim shading eyes that had grown used to looking at the ground. He expected the old rhythm to return by morning, the sidelong glances, the polite distance, the quiet reminders of where he stood in the order of things. Yet as he moved along the boardwalk, two men he had known since boyhood tipped their hats first. Not exaggerated, not friendly, just respectful. It unsettled him more than mockery ever had. Across the street, Mayor Caldwell stood outside his office, speaking in low tones with a representative from the railroad company, a man in a dark suit too heavy for the climate. The representative gestured toward the western horizon where the tracks were meant to cut through scrub and stone. Caldwell listened, but his posture was different now, less certain. The railroad man glanced once at Elias as he passed, then back at Caldwell, as though recalculating the ease of this investment. Mrs. Whitmore descended the church steps with measured grace, her veil still in place, her cane steady against the wooden planks. She did not seek Elias, and he did not approach her immediately. There was something dignified in allowing space after a turning point. The town needed time to understand what had shifted. A breeze carried the dry scent of sagebrush and distant cattle pens, and somewhere a screen door snapped shut. Elias walked toward the edge of town, where the road narrowed into packed earth. He paused at the hitching post outside the general store, noticing that the usual cluster of idle men had thinned. One of them, Samuel Briggs, cleared his throat. "Harper," he said, not unkindly. Elias stopped. "Samuel." The exchange was brief, but it held acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Briggs shifted his weight. "If that spring runs like you say, I would not mind seeing it myself." Elias nodded once. "You are welcome to." No boast, no challenge, just an open offer. Further down the street, Mrs. Whitmore approached at a steady pace. When she reached him, she did not lift her veil, but she inclined her head slightly. 3 days can change a town," she said quietly. Elias looked toward the western ridge, where the fading light brushed the outline of land his father once walked with pride. "Or reveal it," he replied. She considered that, then continued on without another word, her black dress moving like a shadow across the dust. Behind them, Red Hollow breathed in a different rhythm. The laughter that had filled the church earlier felt distant now, like a story told too loudly and remembered with discomfort. Nothing had been signed. No vote had been taken. Yet something far more binding had begun to take shape. In a town that measured worth by acreage and coin, a man with neither had stood his ground, and the ground had answered in his favor without a single raised voice. The next morning broke clear and pale, the kind of light that revealed every flaw in a fence line and every promise in the soil. Elias Harper was already halfway up the western ridge before the sun cleared the horizon, boots pressing into the familiar path that curved through scrub oak and brittle grass. The air carried a chill that would burn off by mid-morning, but for now it sharpened his thoughts. He did not walk like a man proving a point. He walked like a man returning to something that had never truly left him. Behind him, two figures followed at a steady pace. Samuel Briggs came first, hat low, expression guarded but curious. A younger ranch hand trailed a few steps back, carrying a shovel more out of habit than necessity. They had not spoken much on the climb. Words felt premature. When they reached the shallow dip near the north ridge, Elias knelt and brushed aside a patch of dry grass. Beneath it, the earth darkened subtly, a shade deeper than the surrounding dust. He drove the heel of his boot into the soil and stepped back. Within moments, moisture seeped upward, slow but undeniable, forming a thin sheen that caught the morning light. Samuel crouched beside him, running calloused fingers across the damp ground. "It is there," he said quietly, not with surprise, but with recognition. Elias nodded once. "It has always been." The younger ranch hand drove the shovel down a few inches, turning over a slice of earth that released the faint scent of mineral and life. It was not a roaring spring. It did not surge or sparkle. It endured. By midday, word had traveled back into town. A small group made the climb themselves, boots scuffing the slope, hats shielding eyes from the rising heat. Mayor Caldwell arrived later than the rest, coat removed, vest darkened slightly at the collar from exertion. He surveyed the shallow, pooling water without comment at first. The railroad representative did not accompany him. That absence spoke louder than argument. Mrs. Whitmore appeared near the crest of the ridge, her black attire stark against the pale hillside, her cane steady as ever. She observed the gathering without drawing attention to herself, as though she had known all along what they would find. Caldwell finally stepped forward, kneeling to press his palm against the damp soil. He held it there longer than necessary. When he rose, there was no irritation in his expression, only calculation giving way to acceptance. "This changes the terms," he said evenly. "Not defeat, not apology, a shift." The townsfolk exchanged glances, quieter now, less divided. What had seemed like scrubland from a distance revealed something steadier up close. Elias remained slightly apart from the group, not claiming ownership, not demanding acknowledgement. The land spoke for itself. The thin stream threading beneath limestone did not care for town politics or railroad schedules. It simply flowed. And as the people of Red Hollow stood on that ridge under a widening blue sky, they understood that progress measured only in miles of track could overlook the quiet strength that had sustained them long before any locomotive promised to arrive. By late afternoon, the ridge no longer felt like disputed ground, but like common understanding. The townsfolk drifted back toward Red Hollow in small clusters, boots tracing the same narrow path down the slope, voices lower than usual, thoughtful rather than divided. Mayor Caldwell walked near the front, hat in hand now, his steps measured as though recalculating each decision that had brought him here. He did not look back at Elias immediately. Pride required a moment of solitude before it could bend without breaking. The railroad representative had already departed town that morning, his polished shoes ill-suited for limestone and dust, leaving behind only a faint impression near the hitching post outside the mayor's office. It was understood without announcement that negotiations would cool. On the ridge, only Elias and Mrs. Whitmore remained for a time, standing a few yards apart, while the thin line of moisture continued to gather beneath the turned soil. The sun dipped lower, casting the land in long bands of gold and shadow. "You knew it would hold," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him over the breeze. Elias did not turn immediately. He watched the horizon where sky met scrub, a boundary that had never once asked who owned it. "I knew it had not failed yet," he answered. "That is different." She regarded him with a stillness that suggested approval not of victory, but of restraint. 3 days ago," she said, "this town believed it could sell what it had not fully examined." Elias let out a slow breath. 3 days ago, they believed I had nothing worth examining." There was no bitterness in the statement, only fact. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer to the shallow spring and pressed the tip of her cane into the damp earth. "Land remembers," she said. "So do towns. They simply require someone willing to remind them." Down below, Red Hollow settled into evening routines. Lamps flickered to life in windows. The general store door opened and closed with familiar rhythm. Yet conversations carried a different tone now. Where there had once been easy dismissal of a man who owned little more than a weathered shack and worn boots, there was now a cautious respect. Samuel Briggs spoke openly at the feed store about adjusting grazing plans. Another rancher suggested forming a small cooperative to manage the water line responsibly rather than surrendering it for a quick payout. None of it was loud. None of it was dramatic. Change rarely announced itself with spectacle. It revealed itself in practical decisions made by ordinary people. As the last light faded, Elias finally turned toward town. Mrs. Whitmore remained on the ridge a moment longer, her dark silhouette outlined against the sky. She had not sought gratitude, and he did not offer it aloud. Some debts were settled not with words, but with restored balance. When Elias began the walk home, the dust beneath his boots felt the same as it always had, yet the weight on his shoulders had shifted. He was still the poorest man in Red Hollow by most measures. He still owned no broad acres or polished office. But the town had seen something it could strip to flourish. It was never lawfully surrendered. The words did not explode into applause. They settled into the room with the weight of confirmation. Elias sat near the back this time, not hiding, simply choosing not to claim center space. He listened without expression, hands resting on his knees, boots planted firmly against the wooden floorboards. Caldwell continued. The railroad company has withdrawn its immediate offer pending revised terms. Given the verified water line beneath the North Ridge, this council will not proceed with any sale that compromises long-term access to that resource. A rancher in the second row nodded slowly. Another exhaled as though releasing tension he had carried without admitting it. Mrs. Whitmore sat quietly along the side aisle, veil still in place, her presence steady but unobtrusive. She did not look toward Elias, nor did he seek her gaze. The moment was no longer about either of them. It was about a town choosing to examine itself before signing away something essential. Caldwell lowered the letter. Furthermore, he added, after a brief pause, Mr. Harper will be invited to participate in the committee overseeing stewardship of the Western Tract's water source. A ripple passed through the congregation, not shock, but recognition of fairness that would have seemed unlikely days earlier. Elias felt the shift more than he saw it. He rose slowly when his name settled fully into the air. There were no cheers, no grand gestures, only eyes that met his without mockery. I will serve, he said simply. No speech, no reminder of past ridicule, just acceptance. Outside, the wind brushed against the church walls, carrying the faint scent of approaching rain that might bless the valley before summer tightened its grip. The decision was practical, grounded, almost quiet. Yet in that quiet lay something stronger than any contract with distant investors. Red Hollow had nearly traded endurance for speed. It had nearly measured worth by visible wealth alone. Instead, it chose to recognize the value of something buried beneath limestone and the worth of a man it had once dismissed. When the meeting adjourned, people rose without haste. Hats were tipped. Hands were extended. Elias stepped into the aisle not as an outsider granted temporary favor, but as a citizen entrusted with responsibility. And as the doors opened to the afternoon light, the town moved forward not louder than before, but steadier, guided not by laughter or ambition, but by a truth that had been present all along, waiting for someone brave enough to let it be heard. The days that followed did not bring celebration, only work. Early each morning, Elias walked the ridge with two other committee members, measuring the flow of the spring with marked stakes driven into the soil and a tin cup to gauge how quickly it filled. It was simple arithmetic, nothing grand, but it gave shape to something that had once been dismissed as worthless ground. Samuel Briggs accompanied him often, notebook tucked into his coat pocket, recording levels with the seriousness of a man who had learned that small numbers could decide large futures. Word spread beyond Red Hollow that the railroad had shifted its route 20 miles south, toward flatter land with fewer complications. Some towns would have taken that as a loss. Red Hollow treated it as a pause long enough to think. Mayor Caldwell proved quieter in those weeks. He attended the ridge inspections twice, boots collecting the same pale dust as everyone else. He asked questions without edge and listened without interruption. Authority had not left him, it had matured. One afternoon, as the committee stood near the limestone shelf where the water surfaced most reliably, Caldwell removed his hat and addressed Elias directly. I misjudged the weight of what could not be seen, he said. The apology was not dramatic. It did not draw witnesses or require acknowledgement. Elias considered the words carefully. Most of us do, he replied, until we are forced to look closer. The exchange ended there, but it did not need to continue. In town, subtle changes unfolded. The general store extended Elias a line of credit without hesitation. A farmer who once avoided eye contact now stopped to discuss fencing strategies for shared grazing. No one spoke openly of the laughter from that first meeting, yet it lingered in memory like a lesson carved into wood. Mrs. Whitmore remained a quiet presence. She attended one committee gathering, standing at a distance while the men discussed maintenance schedules and equitable access. When Elias approached to thank her, she raised a gloved hand slightly, stopping him before words formed. You stood before I spoke, she said gently. Remember that. It was not humility she protected, but truth. She had revealed a document, yes, but it was his steadiness that allowed the town to hear it. As summer approached, the western tract began to show signs of managed care. Fencing was repaired. Grazing rotated deliberately to protect the dampest patches of soil. Children were warned not to trample the limestone shelf. Red Hollow did not become wealthy overnight. There were no sudden surges of coin or grand buildings rising from dust. Instead, there was continuity. The spring held through June, then July, then into the heat of August when wells in neighboring counties faltered. Each time Elias returned from the ridge with confirmation that the water still ran, a quiet reassurance settled over town like evening shade. He remained the poorest man by ledger, but by another measure entirely, he had become indispensable. And in a place where worth had once been calculated by acreage alone, that realization marked a deeper shift than any railroad line ever could. By late August, the heat settled over Red Hollow like a test no one could escape. The sky turned a hard, endless blue, and the wind carried dust instead of relief. Wells in neighboring towns dropped to shallow echoes, buckets scraping stone where water had once answered easily. Word traveled along wagon roads and fence lines that Red Hollow still had flow beneath its western ridge. It was not abundant, not extravagant, but it endured. Each morning Elias climbed the path with the same steady pace, tin cup in hand, notebook tucked beneath his arm. The water level dipped slightly under the strain of summer, yet it never vanished. It gathered in the limestone pocket as it always had, patient and unremarkable to those who did not know what it meant. Families began adjusting their routines around it. Cattle were rotated carefully, never left to overgraze the dampest ground. Fences were reinforced not out of fear, but out of shared responsibility. Samuel Briggs oversaw the distribution schedule with practical fairness, ensuring no ranch drew more than agreed. There were no posted signs declaring triumph, no speeches in the church, only quiet cooperation, repeated day after day. One afternoon, a wagon from a neighboring county arrived, the driver removing his hat as he stepped down. He spoke respectfully with Mayor Caldwell, asking whether temporary access might be negotiated in exchange for supplies or future assistance. Caldwell did not answer immediately. He looked toward the ridge where Elias stood silhouetted against the pale horizon. That evening the committee met under the open sky near the spring itself. Mrs. Whitmore attended without veil for the first time since the church meeting, her face calm, lined not by age alone but by long memory. She listened as the men discussed fairness beyond their own boundary lines. "We cannot spare what we do not have," one rancher said. Elias crouched beside the limestone shelf, watching the thin stream gather in the shallow basin. "We have enough," he replied quietly, "if we do not forget how close we came to losing it." The words settled heavier than any warning. Caldwell nodded slowly. "Then we share carefully," he concluded. The decision was not generous in excess, nor was it fearful. It was measured. Within days, a modest arrangement was established, a few barrels at a time delivered across county lines, balanced against feed shipments promised for winter. Red Hollow did not grow rich from it. It grew respected. As September edged closer, clouds began to form on the distant horizon, thin at first, then thickening. When the first rainfall finally swept across the valley, it came not as rescue, but as confirmation. The ground absorbed it steadily, strengthened by months of careful stewardship. Elias stood on the ridge while rain darkened the soil, letting the drops soak into his hat and shoulders. He had never asked to be the voice that changed the town. He had only asked to be heard. And now, as water flowed both from sky and stone, Red Hollow understood that what endures is rarely the loudest thing in the room, but the quiet strength beneath it, waiting to be recognized before it disappears. Autumn settled over Red Hollow with a softness that felt earned rather than granted. The ridge above town turned from brittle gold to muted amber, and the spring beneath the limestone shelf continued its quiet work, neither proud nor diminished by the attention it had finally received. Fences stood straighter now. Grazing followed careful rotation. The committee met less frequently, not because the matter had faded, but because stewardship had become habit. Elias Harper walked the path each week without announcement, boots familiar with every rise and dip in the earth. He no longer carried the tin cup as proof. He carried it out of routine. In town, life resumed its steady rhythm. Wagons rolled along Main Street. The church bell rang on Sundays without tension beneath its tone. Mayor Caldwell conducted business with a tempered patience that had not been present before, his decisions slower, his listening longer. Samuel Briggs spoke openly of conserving rather than expanding too quickly. Even passing travelers sensed something measured in the air, a place less eager to chase distant promises and more willing to examine what lay beneath its own soil. Mrs. Whitmore returned to her quiet life on the edge of town. She no longer needed the veil. When she walked along the boardwalk, townsfolk greeted her with the respect owed not to wealth alone, but to memory preserved. She never claimed credit for what had changed. She understood that revelation was only useful when someone else had the courage to stand long enough to hear it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the ridge in long shadows, Elias paused at the edge of the western tract. The land stretched before him, modest and enduring, no longer a contested asset, but a shared responsibility. He remembered the laughter in the church, sharp and careless, and felt no sting from it now. Laughter fades when truth remains. A pair of young boys passed him on the path, arguing lightly about whose turn it was to check the fence line. They nodded to him without hesitation, not as to a curiosity or cautionary tale, but as to a man whose place in town was unquestioned. That small gesture carried more weight than any formal apology ever could. The wind moved across the ridge, bending dry grass in a slow wave. Elias looked toward Red Hollow below, smoke rising from chimneys, lamps beginning to glow in windows. He had not grown richer in land or coin. His cabin remained modest, his boots still worn at the edges. Yet the measure of a man had shifted in that valley. Worth was no longer determined by acreage alone, nor by the loudest voice in a room. It was measured by steadiness, by the willingness to stand when standing seemed foolish, by the refusal to surrender what could not be replaced. As dusk settled, Elias turned back toward town, the path clear beneath his feet. Behind him the spring flowed unseen beneath limestone, quiet and constant. Out on that western ridge, justice had not arrived with force or spectacle. It had come with patience, with memory, and with one man who chose not to lower his hand. And in Red Hollow, that proved enough.